Thank you, Elle. And everybody can hear me? The first thing I want to do, I have a couple of acknowledgements. So thank you very much to Kings for giving us this space and for helping to create this opportunity for me to be here. Thank you very much to all of the volunteers. Thank you to our live stream crew and to our tech crew for being here to do this for us. Thank you to Elle Jones. I arrived on Saturday, and even though Elle has been in and out of 2 different other cities since the time I came, she's been taking care of me. She is the brain behind me being here and helped me get to all the things that I needed to get to, meet all the people that I needed to meet this week. But Elle's been doing that since the first time I came to Halifax. And we went apple picking on Sunday. And I just tell you that to say that, like, it's not only, it's so busy and there's so much work and there's so much conversations that are happening, but Elle also made sure I had some time to do the finer things, you know, the things that we missed, the things that we would be doing if we didn't have to do all this other stuff. I just want to honor you, Elle. Thank you so much. I wanted to give a shout out to Masuma, who I know was probably quite overwhelmed by the response that she got when she walked in here earlier, but I have to give a shout out to Masuma Khan, because she's been fighting something really, really scary and I think unimaginable for a lot of us. And she's been doing it with a combination of grace and integrity and of fury. You know, she's standing up for herself, and I hope that everybody in this room makes sure going forward that she knows that it is not up to her, that there's a community of people behind her understanding the things that she is fighting for and who's willing to stand beside and behind in order to support. So I shout out Masuma Khan. I want to shout out Katie George Jim too, as Elle did. I got to interview Katie this morning along with Masuma. Katie's story about being disrespected by the chair of the Board of Governors at Dalhousie University has become overshadowed, I would say, by all of this other stuff with Masuma and a lot of other things that have happened in the news. But we had a conversation this morning on my radio program. We pre-recorded something. And I want to say, too, that we must not lose your situation of what happened. We must not forget that there's follow-up, too, once again, with the Dalhousie administration in regards to your situation and how disrespectfully you were treated, Katie. We see you, we honor the struggle that you're also going through, and this same community, I want them to give you that same love and support. So thank you very much. And finally, before I start, I want to shout out somebody who probably doesn't think that this is about to happen. Shout out to Reed. Shout out to Reed for holding it down as well with Black Power Hour. And Reed's been driving me around since the time I got here, too. I'm very grateful to him. But I also wanted to mention Amina. Amina Abawaji is right here, sitting in front of me. We just met, but I have to acknowledge you, Amina, because you are not only on the Ryerson, I'm thinking my hometown now. You're not only on the Dalhousie Student Union witnessing and supporting what's going on with Masuma as she deals with this, you are also there, Katie told me this morning, supporting Katie in the aftermath of what happened with her at her Board of Governors incident. And aside from that, you're a student and you're dealing with all the rigors of having to be a part of these administrative groups and taking on these responsibilities, but you still find time to support your sisters, and I see you, right? So I want to say that that kind of work sometimes doesn't get acknowledged, but I see what you're doing, and I know the value, what you're providing to other women, racialized women in this city and on your campus who really need that support right now. So I cannot let that go unacknowledged. Thank you. I could do shout outs like the rest of the evening to like half the other people in this room. Shout out North Preston in the house. I was trying to think about what would be a fitting conversation to have this evening with all of you. I'm so happy to be here. And because we are in a journalism school, and because there has been a lot of really extra debate about myself and whether or not I really am a journalist and what it means to be a journalist, I think I will start there, and I think I will try to use that to frame the things that I want to say right now about journalism, about activism, and about our responsibilities in this country, even if we don't identify with either of those professions or categories. I had the pleasure of meeting a group of students just over here in the other room yesterday. We had a lunch together, and they talked to me about what it's like being a racialized student taking journalism at King's. I will not disclose the contents of that conversation, but I have been hearing the kinds of things that were said during that conversation a lot over the last couple of years since I've become more well-known for the work that I'm doing. And it's a conversation that just seems to keep repeating itself around not necessarily who is a journalist, not necessarily who is activist or an activist, or who's bringing activism into their work, but more so on a very fundamental level, who's allowed to talk, who's allowed to speak, and who is not. And I think about what we've seen with Musuma, I think that that's at the heart of it. Who's allowed to speak? Who's allowed to have an opinion? Who's allowed to express themselves? Who's allowed to be frustrated? Who's allowed to just be? And whose speech and ideas must be policed at all times, lest this social colonial fabric unravel. What I'm seeing is that you could say that there are different rules for different people when it comes to who's allowed to have an opinion and who's allowed to voice it. Or you could look at it and you could say, no, there are the same rules. They're just applied completely differently depending on who we're talking about. And I think both of those things are often true. Sometimes there are different rules for different people, and sometimes there's one set of rules that get applied differently to different people. So, I started my career in journalism 7.5 or so years ago now. It was an accident. I never went to journalism school. So, I get to go home now and like tell my mom that I got to talk to all you guys and be really cool about it. But like, this was not my experience. I'm actually a university dropout. So I don't even have a degree. I went to Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario in my 20s, my late teens, early 20s. It wasn't for me. It wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right thing. I left, and circumstances ended up that after a few months back at home in Oshawa, Ontario, which is a outer suburb of the Greater Toronto area, that I moved to Toronto proper, thinking I'm young, I'm able-bodied, I want to work. It shouldn't be that bad. It was pretty bad, though. It was pretty hard. It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, and I ended up doing a lot of different things. So I got a job at a coffee shop because that was the first thing that anybody would give me. I did a lot of stuff over the next little while about working in cafes or working in call centers. That one still, I think, is the worst that I've ever done. I would go to temp agencies and take whatever assignment they would give me, like filling out surveys at the York University GO Terminal bus loop to people who really did not want to fill out a survey. And in the time that I was doing that, I did not have a permanent address. I struggled to find housing. I would be jumping from place to place, from person to person. It was really hard. It was a lot harder than I thought. And then I had to reflect to myself, if this is what the situation is for me, who came from a really middle class upbringing, whose both parents had a job and had a car, went to school in a nice high school with really good resources and good teachers who cared about us and who had the time for us. If this was like really hard for me in Toronto at 22 years of age, what was it like for people who didn't have all those things that I had? I got a job part-time working at a youth drop-in center. That turned into working full-time at the youth drop-in center. And that was all about supporting young people who in many cases were homeless, in many cases were underhoused, in many cases were dealing with drug and alcohol addiction. Many of these young people, and in general, many of the people on the streets in Canada, through studies that we've done, they are there via the child welfare system, meaning that the state was charged with taking care of them the first time and failed, and then they end up on our streets and in our shelters. I became really interested in advocating for the young people that I was working with, advocating for better housing, for better welfare rates, advocating for mental health services and services for people who were trying to get off drugs and alcohol, or at least reduce the use of drugs and alcohol or the harms associated with that use. I worked at a harm reduction facility, which meant that we weren't telling you don't use drugs, because we know that's not realistic for every single person. We were saying, if you're going to, how can we reduce the harms for you? And if you're ready to do something more, how can we support you with that too? All these experiences really started changing my politics, really started changing the way I looked at my city and my country. But I always wrote, no matter what I was doing, because that's a passion I've always had. It's something I did from the time I was a little kid. I kept journals. They were always for me, though, right? I usually wrote for myself. If I wasn't having to publish something at school, I was writing for my own sanity, for my own enjoyment, for my own memories. And I did what, pretty much everybody was doing circa like the mid-2000s, which was I started a blog, right? It's very embarrassing. It's all still up, and I think about deleting it a lot. But the first blog that I started, which I still use sometimes, I called it Cole's Notes because I thought that was clever. And some of you in this room, yeah, some of you will get that. But then it was like, now I'm sharing things publicly with people, right? So I'm sharing things that I would have just had for myself before with anybody who happened to come across the page and read. I didn't think I was getting much of an audience, and I don't really think I was, but I wrote a piece in February of 2010 because we had had this really problematic situation where police in Toronto had decided to assign themselves to dozens of our high schools. Armed police officers in full uniform with all of the powers and responsibilities of any other police. This really bothered me, and I didn't think it was safe for young people, but particularly young people who are black, young people who were like the homeless that I served, who often were already getting into trouble with police. Some of them are 15, 16, and they're talking about going back to school, but they faced such criminalization on the streets that the idea of having now to go to an institution where the police are stationed all the time, it just didn't work for them. I wrote about how I didn't think that this proposal was right, and a small publication, an online publication called Torontoist, contacted me and said, we'd really like to reprint what you wrote. And I was elated. I couldn't believe that this was happening. Later that summer, the leaders of the most rich countries in the world descended on Toronto for the G20 summit. It was that weekend that I really became a journalist. And it'd only been a few months since I had published that first story about policing. And when I witnessed, hundreds upon hundreds of police coming from other parts of Ontario to get in on this essentially orgy of depravity and of brutality, when I saw people being harassed walking through the streets of their own city, when I saw over 1,000 people arrested and detained in a makeshift prison without charges, released without charges, but also released after some of them were handcuffed for a whole day and night behind their back, released without their shoes, released without their identification, their wallets, the keys to their homes, without medication, without cell phones that they'd taken in, and the police kept everything. This was when I really became a journalist, because I tried to tell that story, and I was one of the first people to have a really comprehensive documentation from folks who had been inside that detention center of what it was really like. And I was like, whoa, I'm a journalist. I'm really doing this. Like, I'm telling these stories, and people are reading these stories, and I think it matters to them. And I gained this new confidence that would grow. No one cared back then if I was an activist or if I was a journalist. No one cared that I had run for Toronto City Council 4 years before I had ever been published in a newspaper in 2006. Most people still don't know that. But no one cared, because I wasn't being effective enough yet, you see? I wasn't bothering enough rich and powerful people yet for them to care. That would come later. That would come in first 2016. In 2016, I had been a Toronto Star columnist for about 8 months. That was the latest thrill in my life. Elle mentioned the Toronto Life piece that I wrote, The Skin I'm In. That piece and the wide readership that it gained launched a new moment in my career for me. And one of the things that came out of that was later on in 2015, the Toronto Star invited me to be a weekly columnist. And they put me on the front page of the newspaper the first day that I wrote and made a big deal out of it. Only 8 months later, I was summoned to meet with the acting publisher and chair of the board of the Toronto Star Corporation. His name is John Hondrick. And John Hondrick asked to meet me, even though I had never heard of him. Well, I had heard of him, I'm not gonna lie. I want to throw shade, but not that much shade. I had never met him, I had never talked to him, we didn't know each other. And suddenly he wants to meet with me. I didn't feel like it could be for anything good, you know? He took me out to a fancy restaurant. He made me order anything I wanted. And it's like when you know somebody's about to give you bad news, so you're waiting for it. And John Hondrick's bad news that day, which now he denies in retrospect, of course, in hindsight, sorry, I should say, is that he asked me to stop writing about race so much. This is someone whose organization hired me on the strength of bearing my soul about a lifetime's worth of experiencing racism and being credited for having the courage to actually tell that story about myself. As an aside, that Toronto Life piece in 2015 was never meant to be about me. I don't usually write about myself, and I don't like to. I started writing that piece about other people in our community in Toronto who I deeply respect and whose work I admire, trying to do a profile for Toronto Life about Black experiences, plural, in Toronto. So I interviewed a whole bunch of Black people that I really admire, and I gave them my first draft, and they're like, nah, this is no good. But you did tell some really interesting personal stories about being Black. Would you expand on those? And I really didn't want to, and I didn't want to implicate my family, and I didn't want to bring up old experiences, and I didn't want a news editor to have to call my friends and be like, so Desmond says that he got stopped like this. Did it really happen? But I did it. And it's on the strength of a piece like that and of a lot of good previous work that I know that I did that the Toronto Star hired me. But now I'm writing too much about race. By the way, John Hondrick, who now denies that he said that to me, says, I didn't tell him he was writing too much about race. I told him he was writing too much about carding. Because you know how the practice of stopping and documenting people who are not suspected of a crime, you know how that has nothing at all to do with race, right? The same pressure that I experienced from the most powerful person at my newspaper is the same kind of pressure that journalism students for the last 2.5 years have been telling me that they're experiencing in the classroom. It's the same pressure that the very few writers of color in this country are telling me that they're experiencing when they talk about systemic racism, when they talk about white supremacy. It's a pressure that we feel as people of color, and particularly as black people in general. But I'm talking really specifically about how it's affecting our institution. We're told to shut up. We're told to take a more objective opinion, perspective. And I want to talk about this idea of objectivity because it really relates to what I said before about who's allowed to say something and who's not. I would like, and I said this to the students yesterday, I would like every single journalism school to host one of these really stupid debates that we like to host in this country. You know, where something that on the one side affects people's lives and well-being and on the other side is just a fun conversation for the other people. And they call it a debate. Well, let's host a debate in every journalism school in Canada. And let's ask not whether or not objectivity, this notion of being objective, let's not ask whether or not that is possible. It is impossible. We are human. We bring our biases with us everywhere that we go. They inform everything that we think. And I don't think it's realistic for human beings to try and say that they are not the sum of their experiences, of the things that they've taken in the media, of the things that their parents and their culture and their community have taught them. We all are, and that's okay. That's fine. And trying to reach this objectivity to me, I don't think we should be asking, can we ever get there? Because we can't. I think we should be asking, should we be trying to be objective? Or should we be trying to encourage out those individual experiences, those individual thoughts and lived lives that direct us to ask questions about one thing and not another, that direct us to be really curious as journalists and as writers about one thing and not another? Should we not hone and nurture that instead of asking people to be objective or neutral? Because I can tell you what happens when we encourage people to be neutral. And now I will go back to what happened to Masuma Khan. Because a university is aware that a white person on campus is uncomfortable with things that a brown Muslim woman is saying. They're aware of that. They're aware that that has to do with a conversation about colonialism and celebrating Canada 150 that's being had all across the country the entire year. None of this is new. They know all this stuff. This student complains that this other student shouldn't be allowed to say what she says, not in the school, not in her capacity as a student leader, but on her Facebook wall. And the school says not that that's ridiculous, not that that would be a complete overreaction to something that you as a student don't like. They say, let's be objective about this one now. We don't want to say either way. We're being objective. So our way of being objective is that we're going to submit the student who's being complained about to months of a potential disciplinary process. And that the process is fair. The process was made by very fair people. And we will wait the outcome of that fair process. And in the meantime, we responsible adults who are watching as Masuma Khan is being slandered and attacked and threatened, we'll wait for our objective process to play out. We wash our hands of even saying anything. No one has reached out to our friend from Dalhousie, not even to say that this decision to withdraw the complaint today was coming. Masuma's name was not mentioned in the press release that Dalhousie made about rescinding this disciplinary action. That's what being neutral gets you, though. That's what being objective gets you. That's what happens when we ask human beings to turn off all of the things that they're experiencing emotionally, spiritually, and submit themselves to a process. A process, by the way, which mirrors the exact same colonial BS that Musuma was calling out in the first place. It is not an objective process. It is a process that's one of those things I talked about earlier that is like, you can say that this is the same rule for everybody, but you're going to apply it differently depending on who's involved. And that's exactly what I think happened. How this relates for me to journalism is when I see things like, for example, we had a situation in Toronto recently where a very racist police inspector who does a lot of press conferences, he made one of his press conferences to talk about the police attempt to apprehend several people who were wanted on armed robbery charges. The media really likes this police inspector because he tries to use inflammatory language as much as he can, and it gives them an easy thing to print. We don't have journalists so much in this country anymore as we have stenographers. They want someone to give them the news to copy down, and they want someone to make it easy for them. Inspector Mike Earle decided that he was going to use this press conference as an opportunity to air his racial grievances. All of the suspects that the police had been looking for in relation to these suspected armed robberies were black. So Mike Earle took the opportunity when he was saying this is who the police have been looking for to call them pathetic parasites. When Mike Earle said that, no one who was in the room who was part of the so-called free media challenged him or asked a single question about why he was using such dehumanizing language. It didn't occur to any of the media that dehumanizing criminals does not help the public catch criminals. It's just your opinion, and you're sharing it in this really, really powerful situation where all the cameras are on you. Instead, CB24, the Toronto Star, Sun, all the major media repeated the words pathetic parasites in their news stories, and most of them used it in the headline. And they used inverted commas to circle the words pathetic parasites. So someone is saying it, but we don't know who. Maybe it's shouting down from God saying it. We don't know who's saying that. But it's important enough that someone called black people pathetic parasites that you had to put it in your headline. That's called being neutral. Because if you had a moment of, creative and independent thought, you might think, why is this relevant? As a person who's supposed to deliver news to people, why is this relevant? And what should I do with that information rather than just copying it down and handing it wholesale to the reader who has no clue who's saying it or why? This is called objectivity. Objectivity is when we have situations like what we had with Yusra Kogali. Some of you know that name in this room. Yusra Kogali is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto. Very similar story to Masuma's story, where Yusra, during Black History Month, was receiving a lot of racist and vile attacks from people online who didn't like that she was talking about Black History Month, and who don't like her organization, and who don't like her advocacy and her activism. Because you see, it doesn't matter what you call yourself. If it's what you say to fight for black liberation, if it's getting out there, people are going to go after you. And they're going to say it's unfair that you're saying the things that you say, no matter if you're a journalist or not. They're going to hold you to some invisible standard. Yusra said, after receiving all kinds of hatred from white people, mostly men, she tweeted out, Allah, give me the strength not to cuss or kill these men and white people. Please give me the strength. Please, please, please. And the media, who are so neutral and who are so objective, they didn't simply repeat what Yusra said like they did the racist inspector and say here was her opinion. No, this was about a racist attack by a black woman on white people, just like in your case, just like that. And there was all of this editorializing going on, and there were all of these calls for Yusra to be removed from a community-based consensus organization. So 10 minutes ago, you didn't know who was a part of BLM Toronto and you didn't care. And 5 minutes ago, you don't think that they are even allowed to be a group. But now you want them to use their power as a group to censor someone else within the group. I really went really hard as I could for Yusra in that situation to say the following. It was like I hoped an outburst of that independent thinking that I'm talking about, because what I said was this, and nobody else was saying this in Toronto loudly. And I think that's not because people didn't think what I'm about to say. It's because a lot of them were scared off by the way that our media comes for people of color and anybody who supports them. I simply said this. If you receive the kind of treatment that Yusra was facing, where white people, and particularly white men, are coming for you online because you talk about black liberation, and then they're saying things about your body parts, they're saying things about violence that they would like to do to you or to people around you. They're saying how they would like to kill you, how they would like to shut you up. Whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian, whether you're Jewish, whether you're none of those things, but if you know anything about the Abrahamic tradition, what Yusra said was, God, these people are testing me. These people are attacking me. These people are trying to bring out the hatred that I know is in me because it's in all of us. But I pray, give me the strength not to return the hatred that they are showing me back on them. I pray. That was all that Yusra was doing, and that is one of the most noble and honest prayers that anyone can offer up. And all these people out here in the media who are Judeo-Christian and who rep that every day, they should get that. But for some reason, they forgot one of the most essential teachings of their own cultural tradition because they were too busy being objective. So I don't buy it. What I say when I do interviews like that and when I do media around these things is that I am not objective. I have a bias and I declare it openly. But what is yours? Are you going to come out from behind this veneer of objectivity and actually tell me what you think? Because then it'll come out. Eventually it'll come out when you print pathetic parasites and somebody has to tell you that that's not an appropriate way to describe human beings. There was a situation in Toronto recently where a woman by the name of Dion Renee was physically and sexually, according to her, I will say that for legal purposes, but I believe Dion, but according to her, she was physically and sexually assaulted by a police officer in the lobby of police headquarters in September before the last police services board meeting. You want to talk about objective media? Dion Renee has a disability which prevents her from easily walking upstairs. So she had gone to the reception desk at the police headquarters, which is where police oversight meetings are held, to get the elevator. Dion's been doing this for years, and she goes and asks for the elevator every time. So this black woman with a disability goes up to the counter and says what she always says, could you please open the elevator for me? And the police officer who's at the desk on the other side of 2 feet of marble and glass says no. And she says, well, then can you call a supervisor? And repeatedly asks, and the police officer, again, declines. Then that officer, who's being egged on by other officers who are watching all of this and having a great old time, that officer who she was initially speaking to, whose name is Jamie Party, he puts on the gloves that we see police wearing. Remember, he's inside a building behind a desk. There are 2 security gates between him and anybody from the public that have to be fobbed in order to open. He puts on gloves. He goes through the 2 security gates that I'm describing, comes right next to Dion, who's been standing there hoping that he's going to let her upstairs the whole time, and he puts his hands on her. And that's when she says that he physically and sexually assaulted her. The space in 40 College Street where the police headquarters are, that lobby is a huge open space. And then there are stairs that go up to a balcony that you can look down from the 2nd floor. There were media on those stairs with a bird's eye view. There were media on the balcony. There were media taking pictures of a police officer with the full weight of his body on top of a black woman who was screaming for her life. There were media on the balcony using their cameras to film down the aftermath of this, where a traumatized Dion Renee is demanding that someone come and help her. For 2 weeks, there was not one news story written, not one TV story run, not one radio broadcast detailing these, except for my show where I had Dion on the air to talk about what had happened to her. But that all changed about 2 weeks later, because we held a press conference for Dion so that she could tell everybody what had happened. And later that afternoon, when all the news agencies who had come to the press conference dutifully went back to their offices to package together a story, lo and behold, all this footage of Dion Renee traumatized appears. An executive from one of, or a senior person from one of these news agencies who I criticized online for holding on to this kind of footage of a criminal offense. She told me that I twist everything around. She told me that I was prejudiced against her news agency and that they were just trying to do their best to make sure that they had all the facts before they said anything. But I know that none of them were going to say anything until we did. 2 weeks. That's called objectivity, everybody. And it's the greatest threat to us doing our job as journalists, because it means that we have to turn off our human instinct when we see something like that and pretend that there is some neutral course that we need to filter all of our work and our thinking and our emotions into, which will make it more proper for the consumption of the public. And that's bull. We can't live like that. And I see this being replicated in journalism schools across this country. I see students who want to write about blackness being told that that's not the right angle. Why don't you try this one? Why don't you talk to some experts? We have an expert coming to Halifax soon by the name of Scott Wortley, who's going to tell all of you about carding statistics. So Scott Wortley, who does excellent work, don't get me wrong, Scott Wortley has done that work for our police in Toronto for many years. So the police disproportionately target, stop, detain, question, document black people. In some cases, they beat us up, they arrest us, and then they charge us with beating them up. They take us to jail, they threaten our family members, they break up families, they get kids called Children's Aid on them. So Scott Wortley does the very polite thing of breaking all that down. And he's not like me. He's I guess maybe he's objective, but he doesn't tell them to stop doing this bullshit. He just analyzes it and says, here's what you are doing, and you need to come to the right conclusion, which is his role as a researcher, and that's fine. But I want to know why they are inviting the Halifax Human Rights Commission, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, excuse me. I want to know why they're inviting Scott Wortley to be the expert, to come tell them about carding after it was revealed here that black people are 3 times more likely than white people to be stopped. So that means that there are a lot of black people getting stopped by the police in Halifax and the Nova Scotia area. But they're not the experts, Scott Wortley is. And I think that that's a really big problem about this idea of expertise, which feeds back into only taking the voices that are objective, that are dispassionate enough to not let their emotions and their experiences taint this dialogue. Is this the world that we want? Because it's not the one that I want. So the question always comes back to, Desmond, are you an activist? Are you a journalist? What are you really doing out here? You can call it whatever you want. I'm not going to entertain that discussion. But I know that if we weren't of the activist spirit, for example, those of us who supported Dion Renee, that footage that I hope now has been turned over to the Special Investigations Unit would never have even made it to TV. And by the way, that's another important thing here is we have a Special Investigations Unit. You guys have CERT, right? Or Serious Injury Response Team. Same idea. So the Serious Injury and Response Team would want to see footage of an alleged assault, sexual and physical assault on a member of the public by the police, now wouldn't they? But if you don't think that that's a news story as a media organization and that's literally your only job, are you going to hand it over to the CERT or to, in our case, the SIU? I had to say this publicly. Like, I hope you guys are handing this stuff over. Because, again, the idea that a crime can be committed by police against the public is part of the objective frame that our media is using. And let's be really honest, because I work in newsrooms. Because of that stenography culture that I mentioned earlier, that desire not to have to think and get emotionally involved, but just to tell some detached story, well, our media are beholden to police to write about crime. Without police, they don't feel like they can actually tell you what's happening. So I have literally seen police being the source of a quote about police brutality against the public. So a member of the public is assaulted, and literally the media's only source is going to the police and being like, so they say you beat him up again. Did you? Did you do that? No? Thanks for your time. Is it activist to demand more? Is it activist to say that our responsibility, as some have said about journalism in the past, is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable? Do we actually believe in that anymore? Or are we just stenographers now? Are we just trying to play it safe now? And I wouldn't be being fair and honest with everybody if I didn't also add that this is a corporate media culture that we're talking about here. That all of us in journalism are hoping to get that job at CBC or CTV. There's only a few in this country, mind you, right? That'll actually give you a decent job with a somewhat decent living. If you play their game. But this is about making money. It's not about telling the truth. Sometimes they do tell the truth. I'm not going to say that, but that's not the first goal. And I think it explains what happened to me at the Toronto Star very well, because I was quite a popular columnist at the Toronto Star. I was bringing the Toronto Star an audience of people, particularly black people, who were not reading their publication, who are not going to their website, who are not clicking on those links that get advertisers money for getting your eyes on their ad. That wasn't happening in a lot of communities before my column. So I was giving that to the Toronto Star in exchange for having work. But what did the Toronto Star really give me? I didn't have a contract at the Toronto Star. I didn't have benefits or a salary at the Toronto Star. I wasn't protected by the union at the Toronto Star. And ultimately, when I left the Toronto Star for the way they treated me in April of this year, I left because I did that thing that you don't do when you're objective. I actually said what I thought. I went to a police services board meeting 2 years, almost exactly 2 years, after the mayor of the city of Toronto, John Tory, said he was going to cancel carding, and he hadn't done it, and the police still had access to our information. 2 years after a promise by a mayor who came out with tears in his eyes, saying that no community's relationship with him was more important than the black communities. But he didn't do what he said. So I went to the meeting 2 years later, and I held a demonstration saying, you've lied. You didn't do what you say you were going to do. I know that you haven't. So you're not going to get to stay at mission accomplished on this one without me saying first that this is not what you promised us. I put my fist up in the air, and I refused to leave the board table. I gave a deputation like I've given dozens of times in my city, and like I had done while being a Toronto Star columnist. And in fact, Toronto Star reporters were writing stories about my activism, and somehow they figured out how to navigate this quandary: is Desmond an activist or a journalist, by just saying in their story that I was both and moving on. But when I stood up in defense of black liberation at that meeting in April, and I refused to leave, well, the Toronto Star got wind of that, and they called me into their office and said, Desmond, activism or journalism, choose one. And I said, I choose my community, fuck you. I lost out on a lot of money that I could be making right now if I had kept my mouth shut and been objective. I lost out on a lot of the profile that column was bringing me. A week after that happened with me, one of the most prominent pundit voices in this country, I'm sorry to say this, it's not a good reflection of Canada, but Jonathan Kay, keep groaning. Jonathan Kay decided to come to the defense of a writer who had said that cultural appropriation of indigenous people's culture and languages and spiritual practices, that's a good thing. That stealing other people's culture and passing it off as your own, pretending that you are them, pretending that you have their history, that you share their pain when you don't, that's fine. And this writer went as far as saying that there should be a cultural appropriation prize for people in Canadian writing who do that properly. And after he said that, John Kay took to Twitter being like, I don't know what's wrong with what he said. Oh my God, can you believe people are mad at him? Like, I just don't get what's wrong with it. Because that's Jonathan Kay's only card that he can play, is to pretend that he doesn't understand what racism is. And then to take up all kinds of space. So he ended up leaving his position at the Walrus shortly after he did that. And he claims to this day that it had nothing to do with the humongous backlash that he received for that. But part of that backlash that I think went somewhat unnoticed was an incredible writer and poet and activist named Leanne Simpson. And Leanne, who is Indigenous herself, when she heard about what John Kay was doing and that he was still in his position as editor-in-chief of The Walrus, said, Walrus, I want you to take down from your website everything that I've ever written and published for you, and I'm giving the money back. This is a woman that has kids. But I hope that what that message that I sent, that Leanne sent, that other journalists who are willing to be activists and who are willing to actually stand for what we believe in, I hope that the message is that there is no progress without sacrifice, that it's dangerous for us, but those of us who are in these positions who have made it this far, we need to make the sacrifice. Because if a journalism student tries it, maybe they don't get out of their program with a degree. And I worry about that, and I mentioned it when I resigned from the Toronto Star, that if this is how I'm getting treated, that one day I was on the front page, and the next day I'm leaving seemingly in disgrace, and I was supposed to be one of the most celebrated writers in this country. What's happening to journalism students who don't have all of that profile and don't have all these thousands of people being like, why did you do that? What are they going through if this is what I'm going through? And it's particularly black women that I see and meet across this country. When I meet black people in journalism, they are disproportionately, overwhelmingly black women. And I know that that comes with extra layers of discrimination, extra layers of scrutiny, extra layers of intolerance for ideas and speech and dissent. So again, I'm in a position where I felt like I can stand up to show other people we need to push this forward for you. You might not be able in your positions to take this risk, but we can, and we have a responsibility too. So these days I don't worry so much about this label. Are you an activist? Are you a journalist? I think it's my responsibility not to be objective, but to be true to the things that I believe in and to fight for those things. And I think that that's what all real good journalism actually is, when it's not pretending to be like, I don't know, you tell me, you decide. When it's being honest, it is fighting for something. And you know something? When a child gets hit by a car, we don't get angry at the journalists who tear up when they're asking questions about this or who are giving their report by the roadside vigil on the 6 o'clock news. We don't say they're not being objective. We're feeling what they're feeling. And sometimes we're grateful that finally somebody who's in that position is exhibiting some true emotion. I think we feel this way often about politicians too, those rare times when politicians are actually going to exhibit a little bit of honesty and emotion. We appreciate it because it's always hidden behind these veneers. So nowadays, I try to worry very much about being true to myself, about being true to Black liberation, and being true to the struggle that I'm in and that I know other people like me are in. And that's the message that I have, not only for journalism students in this school, not only for all the students at King's, not only for all the students at Dow and at Mount and everywhere else in this province and across the country, but this is the mission that actually all of us are on. The power that we have in this resistance is speaking the truth relentlessly, fearlessly. That's why I love Elle Jones. Because when you have the power to be relentless and to speak the truth, that is a form of social capital greater than any money that anyone can give you, greater than any position that anybody can give you. I walked away from the Toronto Star with my integrity, but I also took my significant audience with me. And I will recreate that somewhere else to continue this fight. And I say to you all that when I criticize the corporate media, I have this in mind, is that we do have to fight to create new channels for ourselves to tell the truth if the corporate and existing ones will not allow for that to happen. There are journalists in corporate media who are able to pierce through sometimes, and I salute them. I don't accept these inside versus outside of the system dichotomies. We can do both, and we have to. But again, I think that often this lazy thinking tells us that there's only two options, and usually one of them is about supporting the institution and the powerful, and the other is about supporting the underdog. And I reject that. We just need to do the work that we need to do because we believe in it and because it's right. So I want to stop there. I want to say, again, thank you to Kings. Thank you to the sponsors of this event tonight. Thank you to Elle. Thank you to Iz. Thank you to the people that I honored at the beginning for the incredible emotional work that you're doing. We see you, we love you, we care about you. We want you guys to take care of yourselves too so that you can continue doing this fight. And I want everybody in this room, who is not the few people that I have named tonight, to understand that this responsibility falls to you. It does not fall to me. It does not fall to Elle or to Sylvia, who I see here. It doesn't fall to those who are courageous enough only to speak on behalf of themselves and people around them. It falls to us all. And when you sit and you watch TV and you see one of us and you think, I am so glad that they're out there, the next thing you should be asking yourself is, when am I going to be out there with them? Thank you. Thank you very, very much.